Welcome to the inaugural podcast of the Midlife Awareness Podcast. Tonight we are talking with world-renowned author, scholar, and president of the Jesus Seminar, Dominic Crossan. Welcome, Dom. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much, Dennis, for having me.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, and just want you to know that, as I'm sure you're well, this is the inaugural show for the podcast. And so I really appreciate you coming on board right now. What we're going to talk about today is the book Render Unto Caesar. And we're going to dive deep into it today. I've got a lot of questions, basically about some of the I guess the nitty gritty as far as the book goes. And what I want to do is tie it into what your thoughts are as far as where we stand today in America. Does it necessarily look like the Roman Empire back in the Roman days? Where are we going with it? So to start it all off, why Render Unto Caesar? What was the thought behind it?
Well, okay, I'll tell you the whole story. When I submitted the book, first of all, to Harper, it was, I think I called it Future Vision. And all I was doing in there was comparing, actually, the book of Revelation, all anti the Roman Empire, and Luke Acts, pro the Roman Empire. I was just comparing them as two visions. That was the book. And my editor, who was wise enough to say, well, that doesn't kind of hold together for any popular. Why don't you think of it as the render to Caesar question and what they're doing with it about that? So as soon as he said it immediately, I thought, he's right. Of course he's right. Yeah, he usually doesn't do to argue with your editor in any case, because editors tend to win. But I knew he was right. So I did the whole first part, Render Unto Caesar. And then when I did that, no prompting from him anymore, but I thought, well, now it's kind of awful just to leave. Here's two contradictory views from the New Testament itself. What did those people do? What did people in the New Testament do, let alone today, of course? So then the big question for the fourth part was, I can't very well go into the New Testament and say, well, here's the historical Jesus. Here's what he did. I've just showed you there's two big contradictions in the New Testament. So why would you believe a third one or a fourth one or a fifth one? So then what I did was to go into Josephus, to go outside the New Testament. Not really, honestly, Dennis, because I think Josephus is infallible. Of course not. I read him as critically, or maybe even more critically, than I do the New Testament. And by critically, I don't mean nastily, I don't mean dismissively. I mean by putting him against his rhetorical purposes, his literary purposes, his historical background, and kind of asking openly, what's he up to? For example, I know he wrote the Jewish War to defend the Romans to the Jews. I know he wrote the Jewish Antiquities to defend the Jews to the Romans. Okay, so when I'm reading them, I watch his purpose all the time, same as I do for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's intelligent. It's just the intelligent thing to do when you're listening to somebody. So basically, that's the way the book happened, the four parts of it.
I'm going to start with a quote you had early on in the book. And I went through the book here and I wrote down a lot of your quotes. This book is just filled full of not only history, but just all kinds of stuff. And so the first one I want to start off with, it says, furthermore, within the fuller matrix, we humans are evolutionary and anomaly, a social species with individual wills. Our genetic woe is not original sin, but original state. As such, we survive on a tightrope of suspended over the cosmic extremes of anarchic individualism and autocratic communalism. When we are wise, therefore, we will always walk slowly, carefully, and with relentless concentration. Can you go into that a little deeply for me?
Oh, well, thank you for quoting that. The background for that is this. anytime I write to the New Testament, I'm very much aware that there are people who are saying, well, yeah, fine, fine, but that's about God and Jesus and Christ and the New Testament. I'm not interested in that at all, they might say to me. So I'm not interested in render to Caesar. That's all Christian stuff, and I'm not interested. I want to look kind of with a double vector. One is the biblical tradition. I've spent my life in it. If I didn't think it was powerful, I wouldn't bother with it. I spent my life there, but I'm also interested in evolution, a separate vector. And I'm willing to say to you, if you're not interested in God, or don't believe in God, or think God is quietly dead and buried, fine. We're not going to talk about God. We're going to talk about human evolution. We're going to talk about the fact that our species, Homo sapiens, it's a marvelously ironic title because sapiens, as you know, means wise. And if there's one thing we ain't, we ain't wise.
Right.
Wise. We're smart, but we ain't wise. Anyway,
Right, right.
we left Africa 50,000 years ago and pretty much eliminated all other hominid species, within a couple of thousand years. And then we started in a war on the world. That's the basic truth on the environment, on biodiversity, and on ourselves. That's what we've been doing. It's called civilization. Now, in the Bible, what they really criticize very much is war because they see the destructive power of war, but they don't go anything else. So, for example, the ideal would be you beat your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks, and you live under your own vine and your own fig tree, not a stolen one. They see war. What they don't even glimpse, and we glimpse now, is that maybe the only problem was not the sword and the spear, but the plow is also a problem. Agriculture can destroy the world too. Now it takes more than a plow to do it, as we know.
Right, yeah.
The plow was the beginning. So right now it seems we're lapped. We haven't really solved war. I mean, we're afraid right now that in the Ukraine, we're all the way back to World War I or maybe World War II combined, where we have a rather ruthless leader, a clash in Europe that could go out of hand, as happened in 1914, in August of 1914. Just everyone lost control of it. This spiraled to this spiraled. So we can see war has not been solved. And all of a sudden, lapping it is the environment. Climate change. I'm not talking about climate change. We've always had climate change.
Right.
But we never had it quite as fast as we accelerated it.
Right.
We had time to change. The ice age receded slowly and people adjusted. We're able to adjust, but not if it goes too fast. Not if the water starts lapping at Manhattan. So basically what I'm after is, any way you read me, please understand that I'm always working with two vectors, and my primary focus is where those vectors cross one another. So if you're not interested in the biblical tradition and its vision for the world, which I do think is powerful and precious, that's where I spent my life. Please hear it in terms of human evolution against the matrix of cosmic evolution. And that's really what's going on there. It's kind of a warning up front. I'm talking bilingually, if I could. I'm in the public square as well as the church sanctuary.
Another quote that you have a little bit later on after that, it goes that, we're talking about Jesus here. It says, "You did not go into Jerusalem deliberately, but to be martyred, either as a sacrifice for sin, as an evangelical Protestant theology, or as a model for suffering, as in Roman Catholic theology. He went there because Judean supporters of relatives said something like this: if you are serious about this rule of God movement, take it out of those small villages in Galilee and bring it to the holy city of Jerusalem. Also bring it here at Passover because it's the traditional liberation meeting, and also because pilgrim visitors will then carry it everywhere. Furthermore, we can protect you this Passover in the temple day by day, in the Bethany at night." Can you go into that? Because that was an interesting, the first two quotes that I quoted today is it was kind of mind opening for me, in the fact that because we always believe that Jesus was brought here to die for our sins.
Yeah. Well, let me let me start with history and hold the theology for a moment.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, if somebody were to say to me today, Martin Luther King died for our sins. Now, I probably wouldn't say it, but I would understand what they mean.
Right.
It would mean that racism in this country killed him, and we're still fighting for the sin of racism. I'd understand it. I think I would understand it. I wouldn't say, okay, come on. What do you mean he was just assassinated? No. So hold that to one side. Now, I'm trying to understand Jesus's intention, not by reading his mind, not by projecting my theology onto him, but watching what he's doing. All right. Now, certainly he's going up to Jerusalem at Passover. And the situation at Passover in Jerusalem was tinderbox, because, first of all, they were celebrating a huge amount of people in a crowded space in the temple, celebrating freedom from Egyptian oppression 1,000 years before. Well, all they have to do is look up at the battlements of the Fortress Antonia on the left, what was the northwestern corner, and they can see soldiers there, not legionary, but Roman police soldiers.
Yeah.
All it would take is somebody saying, we're a bunch of hypocrites. Why are we talking about Egyptian bondage? We're under Roman bondage. And there were two huge riots. One in what, let me think, 4 BCE, and another in the 50s sometime, when thousands of people, according to Josephus now, were killed, not because the army came in, but the crush. Imagine, if the troops came down from the Antonia, everyone would be pushing for the southern gates. And you know what happens? People would be crushed to death. You wouldn't have to be killed. So zero toleration, and it was manifested by the fact that Pilate came up from his base on the coast, Caesarea on the coast, with probably 600 extra troops, again, not legionary troops, but his military forces, to defend, protect Jerusalem from that. So that's the situation you have to understand. Tinderbox. Now, if Jesus wants to get himself martyred, Pilate would have been very happy to accommodate him the first evening he got there. All he had to do was knock at the door, say, I'd like to be a martyr, please. And Pilate would have accommodated immediately. I think of Passover in Jerusalem in the first century as, if anyone coughs too loud, string him up and hang him up there as a warning. Crucifixion is on the main road into the city where everyone will see it. And the uprights are there permanently. And so is the smell and the flies and the animals and everything else. So zero toleration is what I'm after. Now, what does Jesus do? Here's what I know, as far as I can tell. First of all, he doesn't stay in Jerusalem. He goes out every night, and it's a good long walk, around the Mount of Olives to Bethany. Now, why doesn't he do that? Every morning he has to go out, come back in. And I noticed that Mark, who's not particularly pushing this interpretation, mentions that again and again. He goes out, he goes back. Because Mark almost spells it out in our terms, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. He doesn't say that, he just says the next day.
Yes.
Second thing is this. Again and again, well, everyone knows Palm Sunday. What's that? Palm Sunday. What happens? Jesus enters Jerusalem from Bethany. So he comes in from the east on a donkey. Now, on the one hand, that is, you could say, is the fulfillment of Zechariah, the non-violent Messiah comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, not on a war horse. But on the other hand, it's dangerously close to a lampoon, to Saturday Night Live in Jerusalem, because he knows that Pilate is coming in from the west. It's the only way he can come in from Caesarea. And he's coming, of course, on a horse. He's not on a donkey, even a mule. Now, I don't know if those two things took place at the same time, but what Jesus is doing is a demonstration. And I'm not trying to be wicked and use a modern term. Did we really think we invented everything? I mean, first time in the 1950s when I read Josephus, what stuck out to me was, boy, this is just like Ireland in the 19th century. Everything that people did in Josephus, we had done. We had traitors, we had betrayals, we had collaborators, we had terrorists almost. We had everything in fighting the British Empire in the night, including Daniel O'Connell, who is nonviolent resistance law. So I was quite at home with Josephus. I didn't find it weird at all. This is what it was like. So when I read Josephus, I understand where he is, his position, but I also see that the history makes lots of sense. So now, Jesus comes up to Jerusalem. Mark says every day, starting on that Palm Sunday, he's protected by the crowd. That's Mark's term is achlas, a singular, the crowd. He mentions it on Monday. He mentions it 3 times on what we call Tuesday. He mentions quite clearly that the authorities, who are, you don't have to demonize, by the way, at all, they're collaborating. Right. The Jewish high priests are collaborating with the Romans. That's their job.
Yeah.
They didn't. If Caiaphas didn't, he'd be pitched out in his ear and another high priest would be in. So I think Caiaphas' point of view is, I'll do my best, but you can't collaborate with your imperial overlord when he can fire you. You just can't. It's a rotten situation. If Pilate was the governor and he was a sub-governor, so he was looking over his shoulder all the time at Syria, if he was dealing at Ephesus as governor, the person who he'd be dealing with would be the richest people in Ephesus. You can't fire them. You can fire a high priest. So it's a bad political situation to begin with. But the crowd is protecting him. The authorities want to get rid of him because he's dangerous. And they're right. He's not violent, but he is what we would call an activist. That's the proper term for Jesus. Person who does demonstrations which are nonviolent. But in the atmosphere of Passover, this is very, very dangerous. How can you keep it in control? So Jesus is protected during the day by the crowds who are on his side, the supporters who invited them to come up there probably, and may have come with them. And by night, he's at Bethany. So everything I read is, okay, now if I'm reading this story, and I don't know the ending, I'm thinking to myself, how many days is it going to take for Caiaphas to figure out what he's doing? Can't touch him during the day. Too dangerous. Might cause a riot. That'll be even worse. Gets out every night, but well, I could stop him halfway some night. I have to wait till he's out of the city, and I have to wait before he goes the northern way or the southern way around the Mount of Olives. I know exactly where to wait for him. And when I read the story, it's in what we call Gethsemane, which is exactly where I've described. Mm-hmm. Now, either Mark is a genius 40 years later to figure out what must have happened, or I can't suggest anything else. That's why it took X number of days for Jesus to be arrested. And once arrested, I think, he was crucified nice and quietly. We see him up in the high hill, pointed up there with everyone else.
Yeah.
That could have been done. Everyone else is involved in Passover sermon, everything else. This was done fast. That was the strategy. Get it done before anyone knows it's happening. So when I read that story, I cannot see Jesus went up to Jerusalem to be a martyr. And by the way, I don't denigrate the possibility of that. A person can decide today too, that the best way for me to get my movement is to be martyred, or maybe even, if I can make an illusion, which I think you will get, to go to jail.
Right.
It could be done deliberately. Now, I don't particularly think much of people who want to be martyrs, to be honest with you, because you need a murderer.
Right.
If you are martyred by doing what you believe has to be done, that's one thing. But to go up and get yourself martyrs, I think is wrong, because every martyr needs a murderer. if it happens.
Right.
So everything I can read about Jesus means he doesn't go up to get himself killed. Now, that said, do I have any problem with Jesus saying, sorry, with a Christian saying Jesus died for our sins? No. But what your sin is not the little peccadillos that you this little thought and you this little that. It's imperialism.
Oh, yeah.
Jesus died from imperialism.
Yeah.
The normalcy of imperialism. The Romans were not particularly cruel.
Right.
They were no better or worse. They were certainly better than the Assyrians or the Babylonians, I think. Maybe as good as the Persians, maybe better than even the Greeks. But that's not the point. The point was that the normalcy of civilization for thousands of years has been imperialism. However you do it, however you change it, sometimes you go and take the territory to get the goods. Sometimes all you have to do is control the banks. Today, we don't even have, well, we like to keep an eye on the territory just in case, but basically, we figured out all sorts of other ways. And the Romans had figured out a magnificent way of doing it by securing the periphery and putting the legions on the periphery, and then everything inside is the Pax Romana. Wow, it was a tremendous invention, what I would call territorial empire rather than a tributary empire. So all of that feeds into me. Jesus went up to Jerusalem to demonstrate God's rule on earth and what it looked like. And he was martyred.
So we're getting now into the preface of the book and your three different points of what you had outlined earlier. But before we get there, we've everybody knows that the title of the book, The Render Under Caesar. Okay, we understand where that comes from, the background where that comes from. But you go into detail about the coins, right? And so could you go into the background of the coinage and why was it in such, because Jesus was having debates at that time over the coins. So could you go into the significance of the coin for this book?
All right, before I do that, Dennis, let me look at the text for a minute, because very often all people ever know is the key word, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And very often they even stop there.
Right, exactly.
Render to God the things that are God's. So let me remind you that that's the punchline of a conversation, let me put it that way, okay? So if I gave you the punchline from a joke and you said, I don't get it, of course you wouldn't. You have to have the whole joke. So here's what's going on. Jesus is in Jerusalem. I think this would have to have happened during the last time he was there, at least one time he was there. The question that's given to him is a gotcha question. It's a gotcha. And we can see gotcha questions all the time today when a politician is asked, sort of a Republican politician, if they're asked, where are they on Trump? It's a kind of a gotcha. If you say I'm against him, bad for your future, maybe if you say I'm for him. So a gotcha question. Do we pay taxes to Caesar or not? If Jesus says, yes, we do, then his followers may all drift apart and there goes his protective screen. And if he says, yes, no, we don't, well, that justifies what the high priests have been saying about him. So it's a gotcha. Now, first of all, what does Jesus do? So we have to read the story. When in doubt, read the text. It's a good principle in the Bible. When all else fails, read the text before you debate it. Jesus says, show me the coin. Oops, he doesn't even carry the coin. But wait a minute, if you don't carry Caesar's coin, silver denarii, how do you pay Caesar's taxes? With what? You give him a small sheep or something in Jerusalem? So that's the first kind of a counter gotcha. Show me the coin. You carry it, I don't. Now, in one sense, it could stop there. I can't pay taxes. I don't have the coins. I'm poor. So it could have stopped there. But then Jesus asks the next question. And this is key now to where the coins come in. Whose image and inscription is this?
Right. Right.
That's terribly important for me. Whose image? Of course, it's going to be Caesar. It's only a question. Which Caesar is Augustus Tiberius? It's always Caesar. But inscription. So you have to imagine what inscription is there that would make sense of what Jesus says next. I lived in Jerusalem from 65 to 67. Got out of it in a great hurry the day the war started, the day before the war started, by the way, 67. I think the technical term is fled. we were told get out of here by our consuls. If you stay, you're on your own. So anyway, when I was there, of course, I was sold a coin of the tribute that were for sale in the souks. And in fact, you could almost get somebody who would guarantee this was the very one that Jesus might have used. In fact, this was the one that Jesus used. But I had the coin. It's a tiny coin. It's about the size of a dime. I could barely hold it in my hand without dropping it. Mm-hmm. So think of a silver coin the size of our dime. Now it's written in Latin. And it's in abbreviated Latin. So if you were to say it out loud, you would have to know proper endings, like divi filios, not divi filii. You'd have to know Latin, and it's so small I can't even read the one I have, except using a magnifying glass on it. Mm-hmm. I know what it says, so I can cheat.
Right.
So this is the one that everyone says is the coin of the tribute. Typical piece of Latin Eurocentrism. Of course, Jesus is speaking Latin to them. Of course, it's a Latin coin. But there's no evidence that coin was circulating at the time of Jesus. On the other hand, we do have a Greek, by Greek I mean written in Greek, a Greek coin larger than our quarter and written in Greek with only 3 letters on it. So you have the head of Caesar Augustus on it. Tiberius is on the other side. It's unusual, by the way. It's a 2-headed coin.
Oh, wow.
Normally, you have at the front, as you know, we have the head of the ruler.
Right.
The back, some kind of a symbol.
Right.
This case is the coin of Tiberius, I guess, because he's on the front, if it is the front. And on the back, you have Caesar Augustus. And it says 3 words, Theos, Sebastos, I'm using Greek. Theos, Sebastos, Kaiser. Theos is God. Sebastos is the Greek word we translate as Augustus. It means the one to be worshipped. Sebo is the Greek to worship. Kaiser. So on the coin, it says quite clearly, God is Caesar. That's what the coin says. God is Caesar, and he's in fact, he's the Theos Sebastos, which is the God to be worshipped. You might say, well, aren't all gods to be worshipped? Is he kind of like the only God to be worshipped? It's a very weird title, Sebastos. Augustus kind of, just sounds like a nice title. But it's as striking a title as Jesus the Christ. Christ is a title. Anyway, so what does Jesus say? He's offered a coin which says Caesar is God. He doesn't say Caesar is not God. He says, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. Oh, God. Oh, wait a minute. That means Caesar isn't God? Because we have to distinguish their things, whatever they are. And he doesn't say what things we're talking about. So you say, coin-bearing people, that Caesar is God. I say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And actually, no Jew could possibly ever disagree with that statement. Even Josephus, who believes that God, the big G, the Jewish God, has given the Roman Empire to Caesar. Vespasian he's talking about, of course. But to rebel against the Roman Empire is to rebel against God. But he never suggests that there's the things of God and the things of Rome. There's the things that God has given to Rome. He's a Jew. There's only one God. You may have to be polite about Caesar, but so what we're left with then is that there are things of Caesar and there are things of God, and Jesus doesn't say which is which and how do you distinguish them. And he doesn't say, how do you live with both of them? Because we live with both of them. We're not angels in heaven. So don't we live under Caesar? Caesar puts Jesus to death, as it were. And don't we live under God? So how do you reconcile this dual authority, as it were?
So as we get into the first, I guess, stage for the book, we're basically talking about the book of Revelation.
Right.
You have a chapter in here titled, What is the World's Longest Lie? So can you tell me what is the world's longest lie?
The theme of the book of Revelation is that actually it's a terribly simple book, because everyone in the first century would have known what the symbols were. Now we can do all sorts of magnificent, conspiracy theories about it, but it was meant for ordinary people in the first century who got it immediately. And here's its theme. Here's its thesis. If you were buying it, say, bound, and they put on the cover what the point is by John of Patmos, they would have said, Book of Revelation. And then underneath in small print, they would have said, in the immediate past, the Roman Empire has slaughtered Christians. Mm-hmm. Therefore, in the imminent future, Christ is returning to slaughter Romans. There you have it. That's the theme of the book of Revelation. You get the impression, if you're reading it, that the only Christians in heaven are all martyrs. That the main activity of the Roman Empire in the last, whatever number of years you're talking about, is persecution of Christians. Now, let me stop there for a second. For centuries, people who understood quite clearly what they were saying said, well, this book is written under the Flavians, probably under Domitian in the 90s. I think that's a consensus of scholarship, and it's right, I think. It's written in the 90s under Domitian. Therefore, Domitian must have been a great persecutor because, see, it says so. Perfect circular argument. It says it, therefore it was. And slowly but surely, in the last decade or so, scholars have come to the consensus there is absolutely no proof that there was any persecution of the church as practice or program from the Roman Empire. Now, I'm not ignoring small little local pogroms, say in a city where the neighborhood comes out to feast for the local god, and Jews, or these new pseudo-Jews we call Christians, won't come out and play and celebrate. Why don't we go burn down their house? Yes, I'm not dismissing the small little nastinesses that we all know about, the pogroms. But I am saying clearly, the Roman Empire never, until around the year 250, when it was too late, thought of Christianity as something that programmatically, as an imperial project, these people need to be eliminated. In fact, not only is there no evidence, there is strong evidence against it, because in the early 100s, Ignatius of Antioch is traveling to Rome to be martyred by the beast in the arena. And he's traveling to many of the same places, like Ephesus, for example, where the apocalypse is written. And you think he might be mentioning all these persecutions. His only problem is obey the bishop. Nothing about watch out for the Romans, or keep your head down, or be brave and die. He's just worried about episcopal control. Not a glimpse of this horror that we're seeing. Also, from the Roman side, Pliny the Younger goes to be governor of Bithynia and Pontus, which is the southern shores of the Black Sea, the place there's rather a lot of action at the moment. That's where he is. And he runs into these weirdos called Christians. This is, I say, we're 115, second century, beginning of the second century. He has to write back to his emperor Trajan and say, like, who they? Who are these weirdos? I've never run into them before. And this is probably the most plugged in aristocrat in the Roman Empire of his own time. Really, about as high powered as you could imagine. And he has to ask the emperor, what do I do with Christians? And he kind of describes them. And he doesn't seem to see anything wrong with what they're doing, but they're causing trouble. So all the evidence is that that is simply a lie, to say that the Roman Empire had been persecuting massively. I take that back. It's not just massively. There is no program for that. I mean, Rome could have decided after, for example, the War of 66 to 74 to forbid the Jews their religion, as it did to the Celts because of the Druids. They could have decided that we crucify your founder, this guy Jesus, and you're still at it. We forbid you under pain of death to be a Christian. That's, in other words, the name itself is enough. That's the way the Romans would have said it. The name is enough. You don't have to prove you did anything. So that is a lie. Now, that's an historical lie. I mean, it just isn't true. Now look at the second half of it. Therefore, Jesus is returning to slaughter Romans. And the books awash in blood.
Right.
Get a concordance out and look up the term blood. So I consider that to be a theological lie, by the way. First of all, it didn't happen, of course. Imminently, there was no onslaught from heaven against the Roman Empire. It just wasn't. It survived west until the 5th century and on the east until the 14th century or so. So no, I mean, the first half is historically wrong. The second half is theologically wrong. It annuls the incarnation in favor of apocalypse. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a peace donkey? No. Yeah, but he's coming back. Got that sort of out of his system, this peace donkey business. He's coming back on a war horse, on a battle charger, and he's going to slaughter. And if you say, well, it's all metaphorical. Oh, yeah. But that's how you call troops to war, with metaphor.
Yeah.
So I'm not happy to say, as some of my scholar friends do, well, it's metaphorical. He has a sword in his mouth. It's the sword of his word. Yeah, but the word could be kill Romans. The word can kill too, if you're in command. So this is a strange, strange book. And when I've said all of that now, what I really had to do is explain to myself, what's this guy up to? Is he simply mad? Does he hate Romans so much? Some people have said maybe he was, a refugee from the War of 66 to 74 when all his family were slaughtered. There's no evidence of that at all. I had to really ask the question, and I think this is the question, the cutting edge question in scholarship too at the moment. Why is John of Patmos so violent, against the Romans? Why, since really they have not been slaughtering Christians? What's he up to in plain language? What makes him tick? And that's where the second main question of that first half comes.
You gave a scenario there towards the end of that chapter where you quote, it says the Roman Empire was not destroyed by Christ, but was converted to Christ. John's promise of imminent, soon slaughter by Christ was historically wrong. And then you get into Nero, which reading your books, I've heard a lot about Nero, and I think it's really interesting, which hopefully we can get into at some other point. But so John basically is saying then Christ of the gospel then becomes the Antichrist of the apocalypse.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. There's been a lot of Christian discussion of who's the Antichrist.
Right, right.
Let me back up to one other thing, too. It's kind of answering that question I just raised. One of the striking things that you notice about the apocalypse is he never mentions the legions or soldiers, who, after all, would be doing all the slaughtering if it had been going on. It's not just done. So, on the other hand, he talks a lot about traders, T-R-A-D-E-R, merchants. And all of a sudden, when I got to that chapter, like chapter 18, I began to realize the Roman Empire was not just about accumulating land around the Mediterranean, like a donut, around the Mediterranean Sea as the whole, just to have a nice, so when we see our maps, it's all nice and red around the Mediterranean. Roman imperialism was Mediterranean globalization. Now, please, again, don't think, I'm just using a modern word. No. As far as it was possible to have a globalization, that's what Rome was up to, all the way from Britain, never quite got over to Ireland, all the way from Britain to the Euphrates. Globalization. So what John of Patmos is really after is not the soldiers or the legions. He never ran into those at Ephesus. But globalization, yeah. So what he's really worried about in these 7 cities is, what about, say, I'm a good Christian. Let me say I'm living at Ephesus. I'm a very good Christian. There's no way I'm going to worship Tiberius or Domitian at the end of the 1st century. I'm not going to worship the Roman emperor as God. Of course not. But I don't see what's the trouble with being involved with my Gentile pagan neighbors in business. It's just business. Now, it is true that when my pagan neighbor has a feast day for his God, and he gives a feast to all his business associates, we do go to the temple and rent one of their rooms, like their conference rooms in the temple, to eat our meal together and have a conference on business afterwards. We don't go into sacrifice, but yeah, the meat we're eating is left over from sacrifice. Can we do this? And this was a huge problem for Paul, by the way, as well, because very often you didn't invite people to your own home because you didn't have the equipment. You rented, like we might rent, say, in a local Holiday Inn, we might rent a conference room to have a business association, and maybe they'd serve a meal, a dinner meal or a breakfast meal, and we wouldn't think anything of it. They did that very often in the temple. You could rent a conference room, and if you wanted meat, it would be meat left over from sacrifice. You wouldn't go into sacrifice, but you'd be eating sacrifice, or you'd even be in the temple. And John would tear his hair out at the very idea. So don't have anything to do with commercial Rome, because then that is imperial Rome. That's what he's up to. So no surrender is it. Have nothing to do with it.
So as we go on from John then and Revelation, our next step then is you bring in Luke and Acts, which takes in my opinion a different turn, whereas John of Patmos doesn't like the acculturation, I guess, of like you just said, the business between Christians and the Roman Empire. It was Luke and Acts that came around that basically brought it together. And so culture then gets accepted and canonized. Can you go into a little bit about that? And besides that, what was the significance of Luke and Acts during this whole deal?
Well, let me start with that, and I'll get back to it in a second. In the entire New Testament, Luke Acts is the only one that got it right, whether you like it or not. The only one that said the future is not Jewish Christianity, it's Roman Christianity. Now, if you want my own opinion,
Please
And
do.
I speak as a historian and a Christian. I think it would be much better if it had been Jewish Christianity, because quite frankly, the Jewish people had been living under empire for 500 years and they knew what it was like.
Hmm.
When Christians finally, in the 4th century under Constantine, when Constantine opened his arms for effect and embraced the Roman Empire, nobody ever seemed to say, well, who converted whom here? Is there a price tag for having the Roman Empire on our side? Is there kind of a deal being made that we take care of heaven and they take care of earth? And is this the split between Caesar and God? What happens when Caesar has a halo on his head, which it constantly did, and is a Christian emperor? Maybe it's all right to be a Christian empire. Oh, maybe the whole problem is that the Roman Empire was pagan. Now we have a Christian empire, so empire is lovely. So there's huge questions. I'm just leaving them out.
Right.
The point is this. If you're reading your New Testament, you know that Luke is the 3rd book in there, and you know that the Acts of the Apostles is the 5th book. And those titles, scholars know, were put on afterwards, so that's not a problem. But here's the question. Certainly, the consensus is, of course, and it's quite obvious, that the person who wrote what we call the Gospel according to Luke and the person who wrote the Acts of the Apostles is the same person with the same sponsor. That's pretty obvious, and there's no debate on that. The debate is this. Did this person, let's call him Luke for want of a better name, let's call him Luke, did he write like a book, the Gospel according to Luke, which was kind of a success and so popular that his editor said, you know what we really need for you, as editors tend to do, your first book was such a success, we need a sequel.
Yeah.
So sit down now, pick up where you ended the first one and write your sequel. And yeah, we don't mind if you kind of look back a bit, to connect backwards. But the other alternative is, did this author, Luke, conceive, imagine, project, write, publish, if you will, a 2-volume work from the very beginning? So in other words, when this person sat down to write, as it were, the plan was a 2-volume work. It never was separate. The obvious objection is, well, why does it look like that? And the answer to that is pure logistics. In the 1st century, a standard papyrus scroll, papyrus now, we're not parchment like the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're tougher stuff. A parchment could only be around 30 feet long. If it was more than that, because it was made by gluing sheets together, when it was rolled up, it would simply burst asunder. The strain would be too much on the outside sheets. And you couldn't really unroll it in one hand and roll it into the other if it was too long. So you could get, around 20,000 words in a scroll. So if you want to write 40,000 words, tough, you're going to need 2 scrolls.
Wow.
Josephus, for example, this is the logistics of publishing. Josephus wanted to write his life. He needed 1 scroll. He wanted to write Against Appian, a polemical work, 2 scrolls. He wanted to write the Jewish War, 7 scrolls. Jewish Antiquities, 20 scrolls. Okay. It's like if I went into a publisher today and said, I have this marvelous book, it's going to be 1,000 pages. And if they didn't say to me, get lost, which they would say, well, we'll have to do it in a 2-volume box set. Like, say, Ray Brown's The Death of the Messiah. And the pagination can go straight through, but no, you can't have 1,000 pages because you'd have to have that terribly expensive paper you get in Bibles. So along comes Luke. The Gospel according to Luke is say around 40,000 words plus. He's going to need 2 volumen is the Latin word for a scroll. He's going to need 2 scrolls. We say 2 volumes,
Right.
1 book. So if you read the first volume by itself or the second volume by itself, you get both wrong. The first volume ends up, for example, with Jesus' followers all in the temple. Well, if you end there, they're totally within Judaism, worshipping in the temple. And one great Jewish scholar said that was the most Jewish book ever written in the New Testament. But they're in the temple waiting to leave. It's like being in a railway station. The second volume starts and goes to Rome. So the first volume, Jesus goes from Galilee to Jerusalem. Second volume, Peter and Paul, the apostles, the Acts of the Apostles, go from Jerusalem to Rome. And when they get to Rome, end of story, Roman Christianity has arrived. That's the manifesto of Luke Acts. In other words, the future is Roman Christianity. And he was right. That was the future. Eventually, under Constantine, who wanted one empire with one ruler, himself, of course, one new capital, Constantinople, and one religion. He looked around and figured all these pagans can't unite my empire. I need a religion. Well, he looks at Christianity. They got bishops and they're organized just like us. Duh, of course they're organized like you. They're modeled on you. I constantly said, I don't see any problem. So of course he supported. I mean, completely sincerely. I'm not trying to make out he's a hypocrite. Right. It made absolute sense to him. Christianity would be the glue for the Roman Empire. So of course he would support it, give large donations to the churches, build cathedrals, and everything. But that's Roman Christianity. And you don't get away from Roman Christianity, by the way, simply by getting away from Roman Catholicism. The same type of a mindset that gave us an infallible Pope gave us an infallible Bible. So I'm not talking about Roman Catholicism. I'm talking about Roman Christianity as it lasted at least until, if you want to say, first the split between Eastern and Western Christianity, and then later between Protestant and Catholic Christianity, and all the other splits ever since. So Roman Christianity, I would consider, for example, any opposition that Luke Acts would never tell. Well, let me back up. Think of the death of Jesus in the first volume and the death of Paul in the second volume. The death of Jesus, a centurion says he's innocent. A client king, Herod Antipas, who was in Jerusalem, says he's innocent. And of course, Pilate says he's innocent before he executes him. I mean, that's the three great points of the Roman Empire: the military, client rulers, or puppet rulers, we might call them, and the governors. Now go to the end of Paul's life in Jerusalem. You have now not just a centurion, but a tribune writing a letter saying he's innocent. And Herod Agrippa II, who is a king, not just a governor, not just a client king, the client prince, but a king, says he's innocent. And so does the governor. There's a perfect storm of Christian innocence rolling through Luke Acts. You've never seen so many people so innocent ending up so dead. And really, you have to say, well, wait a minute. What's going on? Were the Romans kind of savage? Did they just kill people all the time? Maybe John of Patmos was right, at least with leaders. No. From the Roman point of view, these people were what we call activists. Non-violent, but Rome would have called them troublemakers. Rome would have said they create tumult. Now, it could be, say, a local synagogue, if a huge argument about anti-Messianic Jews, pro-Messianic Jews, if it kind of spilled out into the street, that would disturb the peace of a Roman city. They wouldn't worry too much about theology at all. They'd say, well, everything was peaceful until this guy, Paul, arrived. Then we had a riot. Paul's the problem. Well, Paul didn't start it. Well, Paul's arrival started it. If he wasn't here, we've had peace in the Jewish synagogue here for hundreds of years. Paul arrives, we have a riot. Paul's the problem. Of course, from the Roman point of view. That's why after all these innocent declarations, Paul or Jesus ends up dead. So this is a magnificent manifesto for Christian innocence. It's kind of apologia pro vita Christiana, written at the beginning of the 2nd century.
So with that, then, as we get into the Roman Christianity, then what becomes of the cost of acculturation after that? Then,
well, you have to make certain deals, and one of the deals you make is we're kind of in charge of heaven, pretty much, and the soul, and charity. You really are in charge, Constantine, dear Constantine, in charge of earth and the body and justice. So we won't talk too much about imperial injustice. We will talk a lot, and it is good to be sure, about charity, about almsgiving, about you building churches and giving alms to the poor. And certainly, Christian emperors and imperial rule gave far more donations to the poor, the real poor, than ever the Roman emperors did themselves, the pagan Roman emperors, who did give handouts, but very often the handouts went least to those who needed them least, and most to those who needed them least. No, went most to those that needed, I got it wrong, went most to those that needed it least, and least to those that needed it most.
so as we get in now to the third area, so we've had now John come out and speak out against the evilness of joining the Roman Empire. We have Luke and Acts bringing together a Roman Christianity. Now you're getting into Josephus and what Jesus looks like and what Jesus is basically seeing from this other side. So can you now, what was Josephus's role during this?
And let me remind you, Dennis, what I said, and just what I said at the very beginning, that I had a problem at this point because I spent my life working on the historical Jesus.
Right.
So then I could have said, here's what I consider the historical Jesus. And then the obvious objection is, well, yeah, you got that from the New Testament. We can't trust the New Testament. You've been telling us there's different views in there. You can trust it to have a debate, it's like a debating society, or it's like a seminar rather than a decree. So I had to decide how to do it. And the answer was Josephus. So that's why. Now, who is Josephus? First of all, Josephus is a Jew. He was a Jewish priest, and we have his life, by the way, as I said, we have his writings. He was the general in charge of the Galilee during the war of 66 to 74. He was besieged inside Jotapata or Yodfat, surrendered to Vespasian and Titus. Nero had sent his best general, Vespasian, to put down the rebellion in 66 when it started. And Titus was his son, who was along as sort of his second in commander. Now, when Josephus surrendered to them, he prophesied correctly that Vespasian would be the next emperor, which was a little tricky, since if we got back to Nero, he might have had his own ideas about the next emperor coming along. But in any case, when it happened, Josephus, you can forgive him for a lot, but I can't forgive him for this one. He said, our prophecies are that someone from the Jewish homeland would become the Messiah. And we thought, by mistake, it meant a Jew. Actually, it was a Roman. It was you, Vespasian.
Huh.
You are to be the Messiah. The ruler of the world. He didn't say Messiah, he said ruler of the world. So he wiggled in there that, of course, the Messiah would come from the Jewish homeland. Everyone took it for granted. That means he's a Jew. Of course. Of course. And all of a sudden, it turns up Vespasian. So, in his theology, as far as Josephus was concerned, God gives power. He says this verbatim. God gives power to empires. God's power now rests over the Roman Empire. Do not rebel against them. That's rebelling against God. Furthermore, God has given power over the Roman Empire to the Flavian family, the new dynasty. The Julio-Claudians are gone with Nero. And Vespasian is the Messiah. Wow. So you say, well, that takes care of Jesus. How can Jesus be the Messiah in Hebrew, or the Christ in Greek? We've already got one, Vespasian. But then what you find is Josephus mentions Jesus twice. One is a text which has been edited slightly by Christians because, here's a footnote, the Jewish people after the wars of 66 to 74, 113, 115, 132, 135, didn't want anything to do even with Josephus and the record of the wars. If Christians had not taken care of Josephus, we wouldn't have him. There's no Jewish versions of Josephus. In the Middle Ages, for example, Christian authors used Josephus, translated into Latin first and then into French, as a sort of a propaganda tool. They said, well, we have the Old Testament. Here we have the Antiquities of the Jews. See, here's a Jewish author from the 1st century that supports our interpretations of the Old Testament. Not quite their interpretations, just the text, okay? And then they said, we have the New Testament, and here's the Jewish war. And see, God's punishment for what they did to Jesus is the destruction of Jerusalem. So it was a great propaganda bonanza. And that's why they kept it. And we even have editions of the Jewish war in which the illustrations are all about Jesus being put to death. Got nothing to do with it. So in Josephus, however, he does say that Jesus is called the Christ. Jesus nicknamed the Christ. He doesn't explain it. If you don't know what it means, you don't know what it means, but this is Greek, so it's Christ, Christos. And of course, he also gives that summary in that Jesus, 4 points, Jesus started a movement over there in Judea, Pontius Pilate under Tiberius executed him, and sort of doggone it, that didn't stop the movement like it was supposed to. And so it's all the way here to Rome now. So Tacitus and Josephus agree on that short, correct, by the way, absolutely correct narrative about Christianity's origins. In fact, that's what Luke Acts is really doing, a counter narrative. He's trying to control the narrative by telling a counter narrative. He can't deny, of course, Jesus was crucified, but he was innocent. So anyway, from Josephus then, I want to know what's going on. I want to put Jesus in the Josephan matrix. And what's astounding in Josephus, and it's there, everyone knows it. It's not I discovered something. Anyone who can read the text can do it. Josephus, in between the year 4 BCE, but as I mentioned, there was a huge revolt against the Romans, and 66, and there was the next one. That's the 70-year interval in there. Josephus recounts again and again in great detail the invention, that's the title I use, as you know, the invention and practice of non-violent resistance. Not of non-violence, of course. Rome loved non-violence. All empires love non-violence.
Right.
Non-violent resistance. And he describes it in great detail, and he has no sympathy for it. In fact, I think he has more sympathy for a revolt, because that's what people do. But this insidious non-violent resistance, he thinks that's a greater villainy, almost, because he doesn't know how to handle it. He keeps saying it's not in our tradition. It's a fourth philosophy. It's not what the Essenes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees do. It's a new philosophy. These are just philosophies. How can you be mad at a philosophy? These are political factions. they're not philosophies. So he gives you a very good climate about something which I think is astounding, because as far as I know, nonviolent resistance as an organized, massive phenomenon had never been done before. I don't know of it anywhere else.
Huh.
People obviously revolted, of course, in wars, and individuals, I'm sure. But the idea, for example, when Caligula sends his statue to be put up in the temple, because if I'm a god, shouldn't my statue be in the temple? And he sends Petronius with a couple of legions south in 40 to take his statue to the temple. Non-violent resistance. Thousands of people, men, women, and children, Philo says it as well as Josephus, approach his camp in the Galilee and do a kind of a sit-down strike. If you keep going with this statue, you're going to have to kill us. We're not moving. It's described there. I mean, he never uses the term sit-down strike, but if you read it and notice it's the time either of harvesting or planting, depending on Josephus or Philo, that means no food next year. No food, then you might as well die fighting, because you're going to die in any case. So it's all in Josephus, and it's in that matrix then that I put Jesus. Jesus does not invent nonviolent resistance, neither does John the Baptist, by the way. They are both within this matrix of nonviolent resistance from 4 BC to 70, or to 66 to be exact. So it's within that I put Jesus. Now, when I turn from Josephus then to the New Testament, with that model in mind, what do I find Jesus doing in the New Testament? Exactly what I expect. Exactly in agreement with Josephus. He's not out there as a rabble-rouser, a zealot, as it has been interpreted, attacking Rome violently. No. He's saying, for example, God sends the rain on the just and the unjust. Be like God. Well, if God acts like that, then the only thing that's left is nonviolent resistance. And that is how I interpret the most extraordinary thing Jesus ever said, that everyone knows, but gets away from as fast as possible. Love your enemies. Paul comes very close to saying it, but he doesn't say it. Love your enemies. Think with me, Des, how weird that is. Why doesn't he just simply say love anyone, love everyone? You know, why specify enemies? As if you always have them.
Well, and it's hard to love your enemy.
Well, you know, if we're thinking love your enemy, it means an emotional attachment.
Right.
Of course.
Right.
Love your enemies, as I understand it, is Jesus's manifesto motto for practice nonviolent resistance. They're your enemies, so you must resist them. Otherwise, you're conspiring in evil. On the assumption that your enemies are not just, you know,
right.
your business opponents. When Jesus used enemies, he's talking about people who persecute you. He says that. Who denigrate you, who want to destroy you. What he's advising is nonviolent resistance. How do you love them? By nonviolence. How do you resist them? They're your enemies. The only sense I can make of picking out that, rather than love everyone, is that that's another way for Jesus of saying what we would say, practice nonviolent resistance. I don't know.
Is there become a clash? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go on. Go on then.
Does there become a clash then between Josephus and Jesus? Because in part of your book, it says Josephus interprets the God Caesar acculturation as a matter of divine selection and imperial cooperation, but Jesus interprets it as a matter of divine challenge and human confrontation.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if we had Josephus here right now, as it were, and we said to him, okay, now you've called Jesus the Christ. So that means, you know, there's some people at least think he's the Messiah. You know that. Or you wouldn't even know the title. And of course you do. You're living in Rome. These guys are in Rome. And Vespasian is the Messiah. Well, how do you reconcile that? Do you think the title was just a joke? So yeah, I would ask him, Jesus, you're quite right. Jesus is not a violent resistor. If he was, by the way, this is another interesting one, the Romans made a clear distinction in law between violent resistance. If you're a governor and there were violent resistance, you grabbed a whole bunch of them. You didn't even need a trial, and you crucified them in a nice big row so people understood. This group, like Barabbas and those in jail with him, these are a violent group. They all must be crucified, as many as you can get of the top leadership. What did the Romans do according to civil law with somebody we call an activist? They would somebody who stirs up the people, quote, or causes a tumult among the people. They said that person should either be, depending on their status, either be crucified, thrown to the wild beasts, or sent to an island. That's exactly what Rome did to Jesus. They did it exactly right. If they crucified his 11 or 12 followers with him, no, that would have been wrong.
Right.
Even if all you knew is that Pilate crucified Jesus and didn't round up the 11 or 12, that would tell you that from the Roman point of view, this guy is a non-violent resistor. Now, I'm insisting on the word resistor because a lot of people, my friends say, oh yeah, we know Jesus was non-violent. No, Rome loved people who were non-violent. They would have canonized him, as it were, for being non-violent. It's the non-violent resistance that gets you crucified. So yeah, from Josephus, and Tacitus again says the same thing, they crucified Jesus, nothing about his followers. You would have a pretty good idea that Jesus was a non-violent resistor against Roman law and order, and he was crucified correctly as a lower class person who had created a tumult and disturbed the people from the Roman point of view. And everything makes absolute sense, including the creed that says crucified under Pontius Pilate, if you wanted to know what really happened. Yeah.
So basically now to summarize this book, we have then your first area where the acculturation between Caesar and God is demonized through from John on Patmos there in Revelation. Your second area is, on the other hand, the book of Luke and Acts then basically acculturates and wants Roman to be Christianized.
Yeah.
And then your third area then is where Jesus comes in and says, the solution was not to consider God and Caesar in the life of the historical Jesus, but from outside the New Testament, basically now becomes this non-violent now resistance. And so a couple of quotes I want to end with, and then I have a question for you. So a couple of quotes. One is the biblical tradition. Caesar was never just Caesar, and Rome was never just Rome. The Roman imperialism and its Mediterranean globalization were no more or no less than the normalcy of civilization at the time and the place. And I think getting one major thing that I think I myself deal with, and I'm sure a lot of people deal with, is trying to put a 2023 idea of reading the Bible, knowing what was going on at the time, but we just can't equate the two.
Yeah.
And I think that this, one things that I've really been enjoying while reading your books is you are really trying to go out of your way to put the context to realize that the Bible at this point was never written. And we have to put Paul, we have to put Jesus, we have to put everything that was going on through these authors in the time and place that they were in. And it was a much different time and place. And so what I'd like to end with is, do you think, and there's a quote in here towards the tail end, that do you think that now the US, in its time and place as we are right now, is becoming more like the Romans, the Roman Imperial, during Jesus's time?
Look, it's almost becoming a cliche, and I'm slightly embarrassed. The quotation I put from another author of that book has been criticized. But look, here's what you've got. Rome started off with a king. Let me use a neutral term, with an autocrat. It started off with an autocrat. It got rid of the autocrats and created the Senate and people of Rome, created a democracy, a senatorial democracy. Then it went and created an empire. These are consecutive. Created an empire. Then it had a civil war. Julius Caesar went west, took over all of France, as it were, and Pompey went all the way and took over Syria. And you had the two leaders. It was a marvelous idea. Let's not have one leader, because we're right back to the autocrat. So we'll have two, they call them consuls, each year, and they'd only be in for a year, and then they'd both be out. And it was a marvelous idea. It was almost as good as our ideas of balance of power. They'll have a balance of power in for a year, as it were. How much damage can they do for a year? Well, they found out. Caesar took care of all of Julius Caesar took care of all of Gaul, Pompey of Syria, and they kind of looked across the Mediterranean at one another, said, "I'm not coming back to obey you," and they went to war. Now, it was great fun when the legions were devouring the Celtic tribes, But when they were on either side with battle-hardened legions, it looked like the end of the Roman Empire. And our civil war took only 4 years. And we know what happened when we had those weapons on both sides and weren't just using them against native peoples. They had 20 years of savage civil war from, in round numbers, 50 to 30 BCE, on again, off again, on again, off again, worse maybe than that, before Caesar Augustus brought peace. And all of a sudden, then you had what? An autocrat. So autocrat, senatorial democracy, empire, civil war, autocrat. Now, I'm waiting for the next election.
Yeah.
To see whether we're fully in conformity with the Roman Empire.
Wow.
We've had our civil war. We got rid of our George III, and I'm waiting to see the future of America. And it's not just this person or that person. It would be easier if it was this person or that person. What's happening is that whenever let me go back to the first century, where I spent my whole professional life. It's a fascinating century because I've just described what Rome is going through. I mean, by the beginning of that century, of course, after 31 BC, after the Battle of Actium, Augustus has arrived. So he's brought peace to the Roman Empire. So really, it has quietened down. But it's going through the change from a senatorial democracy, the Senate and people of Rome, to by whatever name. He doesn't say, I'm an autocrat. He wouldn't say that, or a king, God knows. He said, I'm a princeps. I translate that, first among equals, with all the equals dead. I'm just first among equals. Yeah, just try and criticize me and see what happens to you. So yeah, they went from autocrat, the full cycle, through empire, civil war, Senate and people, back to autocrat. I don't know whether our institutions are strong enough. Theirs weren't, by the way. Their institutions, they had the Senate.
Yeah.
And the reason that their institutions weren't strong enough, because to put it bluntly, the senators were more involved in being being rich senators than good rulers. You know, it's hard not to.
Right.
You've had this, the whole world kind of handed to you on a plate. And you mean you might still have to rule it well? Apart even from the army or anything else. So it's hard, honestly, despite the dangers of the cliche, and people say, well, there's no similarities. And, you know, if you want something closer to home, try the French Revolution. You lost the king and got Bonaparte. Because again, the chaos of the middle period is too much. So I'm interested, however, honestly, not just in America, though of course I'm interested. I became a citizen in the year 2000. I've been here since 70. I came here in 51 on the Queen Mary, and apart from 6 years going back to Rome, Jerusalem, places like that for studies, I've been here. I only became a citizen in 2000, and I did it quite deliberately.
Yeah.
Really, because I thought this country was becoming dangerous. I applied for citizenship in 1997 when Newt Gingrich took out his contract on America, the way I like to put it. I thought, this country, something is happening in this country.
Wow.
I don't think I'm safe here as simply the green card, even though I've been on it for since I returned in 61. I felt perfectly safe in this country. It never occurred to me that it was laziness, to be honest with you. I didn't want to have to go through all the work of becoming a citizen, because I've been out of the country so much, and in every country in Europe and the Middle East, and I couldn't fill out all the forms correctly. So, but it started really for me in the 90s.
Wow.
And it's the future of the country that is at stake very clearly. And institutions, even though you think they're so strong, they're not really stronger than the people who support them. If enough of those people are careerists, that's that other line in there about careerists who would give up their vision and their mission for their career. That's a universal. That's not anything American. That's Roman and everything else and everything there. So yes, there is a question and there is a parallel. And there is a parallel in the Christian responses to these things. It would be nice to say they're 2,000 years old. But I think, honestly, Dennis, when I left the monastery and the priesthood, if I'd wanted to say, well, I think the Bible now, I've had enough of it. It was their idea, because it was their idea that I get a doctorate and all the rest of it. That was my idea. That came with being a monk. Do what you're told. They said, you've had 5 years of Greek, 5 years of Latin in the high school. Go get yourself a doctorate. They did it. I could have decided then, this Bible stuff, I've had it. This is 1969. I'm out of the monastery. I'm out of the priesthood. I think I prefer Shakespeare. I'd become a student of Shakespeare. That would be my only alternative choice, to be honest with you, that I think I could spend a lifetime without getting bored. Yeah. So there was no pressure that I had to do this. But
Well, I'm going to end with our session with this, and it becomes a quote at the end of the book from Mike Duncan under "This is how the Republic ends," and I think it was, you were just alluding to a lot of this. The seeds of American decline were sown not in the past 15 years of war and recession, but in the 1970s, when economic inequality began to rise. A process that not only has accelerated in recent years, and the decline of the Roman Republic shows sharp inequality left unaddressed can be catastrophic, unleashing political and social consequences that can bring even centuries-old republic to an end. Dom,
Right.
I thank you so much for this session. I can't wait for our next session. I can't wait really to get into this book, um, How to Read the Bible and Still Be a Christian, because that book is just chock full of just history and just all kinds of good stuff. And I can't wait to talk to you about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you again, Dennis. Anytime. Take care.